The goddess does not ask your permission. When she decides you belong to someone, she simply arranges the world until you collide. And then she watches, patient as stone, while you pretend it didn't happen. From the rites of Selun, scratched into the wall of the Thornvale den by an unknown hand, there is a moment, the elders say, when the bond snaps into place. Not a gentle thing, not a warm settling of recognition, not a soft voice in the back of the mind that whispers there. The elders lie about this, or forget, or perhaps their own bonding was so long ago that the memory has gone smooth, and unthreatening the way river rocks go smooth. The truth is rawer than what they describe in ceremony and song. The truth is, it arrives like a crack of light through a sealed room, like the world splitting along a seam that was always there, unnoticed, and now cannot be unnoticed. Like breathing normally for 24 years and then, between one inhale and the next, discovering that you have lungs. The truth is, you will fight it if you have any instinct toward self-preservation at all. You will rage at it, deny it, wrap your pride around yourself like armor and insist that the goddess made a mistake, which is, of course, the one thing the goddess never does. Riva Ashvane knew all of this. She had read the rites. She had heard the songs. She had sat through the ceremonies on the night of the full Selun moon and listened to the elder women describe the bond with their soft voices and their soft eyes, and she had thought, not me, not like that, not ever. She was wrong, of course. They always are. The forest spoke differently at dawn. Not the language of birds, though the birds were there. The deep, bone-wet morning call of the tree creeper. The brief silver argument of a pair of jays above the eastern ridge. But beneath those, the forest's own voice. The slow exhalation of soil releasing the night's cold. The creak of ancient rootwood settling as the temperature shifted. The sound of water moving through the deep places where the underground streams ran below the Ashenwilde's oldest trees. Riva heard all of it. She ran ahead of it. She ran with the particular quality of someone for whom running was not exercise, but expression. Not a going toward, but a state of being. A declaration of what she was when no one was asking her to be anything in particular. In wolf form, she was black-furred and long-limbed, and low to the ground in that characteristic way of the deep forest Thornvale wolves, built for threading through close-grown trees rather than open sprinting. Her paws made almost no sound on the loam. Her ears worked independently of each other, scanning separate sectors of sound. Her nose read the morning like a living document. Cold stone, damp earth, the old musk of a fox that had crossed this trail 4 hours ago, the green metal smell of water on iron-rich rock 30 yards to her left. She was 24 years old, the second daughter of Alpha Dren Ashvane of the Thornvale Pack, and she was by universal agreement within the pack, stated with varying degrees of admiration and exasperation, the most difficult person any of them had ever known. This assessment was not inaccurate, and Riva knew it, and found it, on balance, acceptable. She crested the ridge above the Ashenwilde's northern bowl just as the sun broke the ridgeline of the Stoneback Mountains to the east, and the light came through the trees in long horizontal shafts, and the whole forest went gold for a moment, and she stopped. The wolf self stopped, always, for this, not because beauty demanded acknowledgement, but because beauty was information. The quality of the light told her the temperature. The direction of the shadows confirmed her position. The way the mist rose from the northern bowl confirmed that the temperature differential between the hollow and the ridge was larger than expected, which meant the night had been colder than forecast, which meant the eastern border patrol would have moved faster to stay warm, which meant their tracks would be further north than yesterday. She was always calculating something. It was, according to her older sister Lyra, at once her greatest quality and her most exhausting one. Ravash shifted back to her human form at the ridge's edge. The change practiced enough to be nearly painless. A long exhale and a reshaping, the wolf self settling beneath the surface like a coal banked for later, and pulled the clothing she'd knotted around her ankle in a waterproof pouch. Worn dark trousers, a long-sleeved linen shirt, boots that she laced with the impatient efficiency of someone who found footwear a necessary inconvenience. She stood on the ridge in the morning light, lean and upright, and looked out over the territory. Thornvale lay below her and to the south, not a town exactly, more a deep forested settlement, the kind that had grown organically from wolves who built where the land suggested rather than imposing a grid. The permanent structures were stone and timber, low and solid, built to withstand the winters that came hard off the Stoneback Mountains. The older buildings had moss on them, had trees growing close enough to touch, had the look of things that had decided to become part of the forest rather than a challenge to it. Around them, the training grounds, the communal hall, the healing house with its herb garden. And further out, the scattered homesteads of individual pack families, connected by paths that only made sense if you had walked them 100 times. Home, she felt the word in her chest the way she felt weather approaching, a pressure, not unpleasant, but complex, full of things she didn't always have the language for. She had been born here, would die here probably, served the pack as a tracker and scout, which suited her better than any of the alternatives. She was too independent for patrol, too easily bored for guard duty, too honest for diplomacy. Tracking required something between solitude and purpose, which was her natural habitat. She went out, she read the land, she came back with information. The land didn't argue with her. The land didn't have opinions about how she carried herself. The land was, in this and several other respects, superior to most people she knew. She was about to descend when the wind shifted. The shift was small, a quarter turn, bringing the air from the south-southeast instead of the southeast, which should have been meaningless. It was morning. The wind would shift a dozen times before noon. Ravac cataloged wind direction by reflex, had been doing it since she was 8 years old, and had decided that information was the only protection worth trusting. This particular shift brought pine resin, wet stone, the faint mineral trace of the spring that fed the communal training ground. And beneath all of that, laid over everything like a skin, him. She went very still. The scent was not close 50 yards, maybe more, moving downhill on the southern slope. The easy, slightly rolling gait of someone in no hurry, comfortable in the forest, comfortable in general, the way people were comfortable when they had never had reason not to be. The cedar and dark earth smell of him that she would have been able to identify out of a forest full of wolves since she was 16 years old and had realized, with a fury she had immediately buried to considerable depth, that she couldn't stop noticing it. Calder Voss. She moved northeast, away from his trajectory, with the controlled speed of someone who was absolutely not retreating, but simply had other places to be. He wasn't supposed to catch up to her. In 4 years of sharing a territory, 4 years of pack meetings and training runs and border patrols and seasonal hunts, he had never once been faster than her in the forest. Not because he wasn't fast, he was fast. Startlingly so for someone built like he was, all dense muscle and broad shoulder. But because Rava the Ashenwilda was the Ashenwilda itself, was the accumulated knowledge of 10,000 morning runs rendered into instinct. And she knew every root and hollow and game trail, and she moved through it like the forest owed her something. She was 200 yards northeast, angling toward the long spur that would take her around and down to the settlement from the back, when she heard him shift direction. He adjusted his course. He was following her trail. She stopped walking. She could have kept going, should have, by every measure of self-interest she possessed, and she possessed considerable measures. But stopping felt, in this particular moment, less like surrender and more like the refusal to appear to run. She had not become the person she was by appearing to run from anything. She was leaning against a silver birch, with her arms crossed, when he broke through the underbrush 2 minutes later. Calder Voss at rest was a significant physical fact. He was not the tallest wolf in Thornvale. That honor went to Oren, his lieutenant, who was lanky and loose-limbed and perpetually amused. But he was built with a density that made him seem to occupy more of a space than his dimensions should allow. Dark hair, always slightly disordered, the kind that looked like carelessness but sat with the precision of something that couldn't be otherwise. Eyes so dark they were almost black, with a quality in them that Rava categorized as watchful and had, for reasons of strict personal policy, refused to look at directly for approximately 3 years. He was carrying his boots. He'd been running barefoot in the dawn, which was either careless or deliberate, and with Calder Voss she had never been entirely sure which was which. He looked at her the way he always looked at her, which was to say, like he was reading something she had not given him permission to read, and the corner of his mouth lifted, very slightly. "You went northeast," he said. "I have business northeast. You were heading south when you crested the ridge. I saw your outline against the sun." She held his gaze with the steady, unblinking attention of a wolf who had decided a long time ago that looking away was a form of retreat. "Good morning to you too, Calder." "Good morning, Rava." He said her name the way he always said it, with a deliberate quality, a slight emphasis, as if the syllables were worth the attention. She had decided years ago that this was an affectation. She was not always entirely convinced by her own decision. Early run. Border check. Eastern spur shows signs of Stormridge scouts moving south. I wanted to read the trail before the morning patrol mudded it. He straightened at this, the easy stance shifting to something more alert, the wolf self surfacing slightly beneath the human face. This was the thing about Calder that she hated most with her most practical mind. He was genuinely competent. Annoyingly, comprehensively competent. There was no satisfaction in disliking someone who was actually very good at being what they were. "How far south?" he said. "To the boundary marker stones at minimum. I'll know more when I read the eastern spur." She pushed off the birch. "I'm sure you have things to occupy you." The slight emphasis on "you" was, she knew, transparent. She did it anyway because transparency was its own armor. If she acknowledged the shape of her own sharpness, no one could use it against her. Calder smiled. Not the practiced charm smile she had watched him turn on half a dozen pack women over the past 3 years. A different one, smaller and less deployed. The one he seemed to have reserved as a personal irritant specifically for her. "I'll come with you," he said. "I work alone." You track alone. 2 sets of eyes on a Stormridge incursion is pack protocol, and you know it. She did know it. She had written that particular protocol in the terse, unornamented prose of someone who hated administrative work and got it done as quickly as possible. She stared at him. "Fine," she said, "keep up." She shifted before he could respond, dropped to 4 legs and was moving before the change had fully resolved, driving north along the spur ridge with the full, focused speed of someone who wanted very much not to think about the sound of his footsteps behind her. They read the Stormridge Trail together in a silence that was, by Ravaz standards, functional. She tracked. He mapped. She pointed with her nose, and he crouched to examine what she had found and said things like 3, maybe 4, last night before midnight, and see how the Western scout overstepped. They're using a different formation than last month, and she said yes, and I noticed. And that's what concerns me, and it was. She hated acknowledging this even internally. It was good. He was good at this. He read terrain with the same particular attention she did, with the quality of someone who had chosen competence over performance and found, in the choosing, a kind of satisfaction that didn't need an audience. This was the version of Calder Voss that she had never been able to work out what to do with. There was the other version, the one that half the pack saw, that women 2 valleys over had apparently heard about, that had provided an audience of admirers at pack gatherings for 3 years. That version was easy. That version was manageable. That version was the powerful, lazy charming, slightly arrogant future beta who let people come to him because they always did, who accepted the attention of the women who sought it with the comfortable ease of someone who had never had to fight for anything. She had an entire architecture of dismissal built for that version of him. It was robust and well-maintained, and she serviced it regularly. The version crouching beside her now, tracing a wolf print in the soft soil with one careful finger, utterly focused, speaking in the short, precise language of 2 people who understood the same things. That version kept finding gaps in the architecture. 6, she said, not 4. She indicated a compressed area of undergrowth 7 feet from where he was looking, where a wolf had waited in one position long enough to flatten the vegetation in a circle. Sentries stayed here, not moving. They were observing, not just passing through. He turned to look. His shoulder almost touched hers as he shifted his weight. "They're mapping us," he said quietly. "Yes," she moved back, creating the distance. "I need to bring this to Lyra this morning. She'll want to convene the border captains before the week is out." "I'll come with you." "You don't need to." Riva, just her name in that direct way, and something about the directness made her go still for 1/2 second before she had it managed. "I'm the designated beta. This is my business as much as yours." She looked at him for a moment. He looked back. The morning light was coming through the trees at a low angle, and it caught the dark of his eyes and made them less dark than she usually experienced them, warmer, with more depth to them than simple watchfulness. She cataloged this and filed it under irrelevant with the efficiency of long practice. "Then walk fast," she said, and turned toward Thornvale. Lyra Ashvane ran her morning briefings like she ran everything, with the clean, confident efficiency of someone who had been born to lead, and had spent every subsequent year learning the tools that nature had not provided at birth. She was 3 years older than Reva and looked it in the best sense. A face that had grown into itself, the command in it not softened, but deepened by time, the kind of authority that was worth more than the louder kind because it had nothing to prove. She took in Reva's report with full attention, asked 6 precise questions, requested that Calder's territorial assessment be added to the official record, and then turned the full quality of her attention, which was, Reva had always thought, uncomfortably similar to Reva's own to the two of them. "I want a full read of the eastern boundary before the week's end," Lyra said. "A 2-person team at minimum. You're both free." The pause that followed was, by any reasonable standard, too short to count as a pause. Reva filled it. "I can bring Sable," she said. "She's been wanting field time." Lyra's expression did not change. This was another irritating quality they shared, the ability to be entirely unreadable on the face while making it perfectly clear that they were reading you with considerable precision. "I'd prefer Calder. He has the territorial maps and your tracking speed is the asset I need out there, not Sable's nose. No offense to Sable." "None she'll ever know about," Calder said pleasantly, from where he was leaning against the doorframe of Lyra's receiving room. He had been there for the entire briefing, not quite at ease and not quite at attention, occupying the particular neutral zone of someone who had decided he was entitled to the room without being proprietary about it. When he caught Reva looking at him, the corner of his mouth moved. She looked back at Lyra. "Fine," she said. "When?" 3 days. That gives the Stormridge Scouts time to make another pass if they're going to, and gives you both time to cross-reference the patrol logs." Lyra paused. "Get some sleep first. You've been on since before dawn, Reva, and you look like you're going to bite someone." "I always look like I'm going to bite someone." "Today it's specific," Lyra said, and turned to the window, which was the most effective dismissal in her repertoire. Reva's best friend Sable was waiting for her outside the common hall with a cup of tea, and an expression that indicated she had been waiting long enough to develop opinions. Sable was one of those people the world seemed to have assembled from exclusively warm materials. Warm brown skin, warm hazel eyes, a laugh that arrived fully formed and genuine every time. She had been Reva's most constant companion since they were 6 years old, and Sable had walked up to Reva on the training ground and said, without preamble, "You're the only one here who's paying attention to how the exercise actually works instead of who's watching." Which had been accurate, and which had established the terms of the friendship immediately. "East Boundary Run," Sable said, handing Reva the tea. "With Calder." Reva took the tea. "How do you know that?" "Orin told me. Orin knows everything Calder knows approximately 4 minutes after Calder knows it. It's a gift." Sable fell into step beside her, matching Reva's clipped pace with the practice of long years. "And before you tell me it's professional and irrelevant, I want to point out that you're holding that cup slightly too hard." Reva looked at the cup. She was, in fact, applying more pressure to it than the situation warranted. She consciously corrected this. "It's professional and irrelevant." Sable was quiet for approximately 6 steps, which was a record of restraint. He wasn't at the midsummer gathering with anyone. "I don't track his social calendar." He was at the last 3 pack socials without a companion. Before that it was Varen, the healer's apprentice. Before her it was someone from the Ironcliff delegation. I forget her name. Sable's tone was meditative. He's been pulling back from all of that for about a season now, maybe longer. Sable, I'm just observing. Observe something else. Sable smiled into her own cup with the composure of someone playing a very long game. She had been playing some version of this game for approximately 8 years and showed no signs of tiring of it. I will observe that you got up before dawn to run a ridge that isn't your assigned patrol area. I told you. Has been sending scouts south for 3 weeks. I know. I also know the East Spur isn't the first place I'd check for new activity, which means either you went northeast for another reason or you had information I don't have. She paused. Do you have information I don't have? Rivas stopped walking. Sable stopped beside her. They were in the herb garden behind the healing house, which was deserted at this hour, which was probably why Sable had steered them here. His scent, Rivas said, because Sable already knew, and lying to Sable was an exercise in pointlessness that she had given up at age 14. He'd been on the South Ridge. I went northeast. Sable was quiet for a moment. Then, Rivas. Don't. You've been doing this for years, going around him, going northeast when he's south, going early when he's going late, organizing your whole. I am not organizing my whole anything around. You're the most self-aware person I know, Sable said, with the calm of absolute conviction, which makes it very strange that you won't say the thing out loud. Rivas looked at the herb garden, at the lavender and the pressed sage and the small, fierce yellow flowers that bloomed late and refused to be discouraged by the shortening days. She thought about saying it, the actual thing, out loud, in words that were shaped precisely enough to match what she actually felt, and felt the familiar resistance close over it like water over a stone. Not denial. Denial was simple. This was something more complicated, the knowledge that some things once named could not be unnamed. That numbing changed the shape of a feeling, made it real in a different way, made it something you had to be responsible for. He runs after everything that runs toward him, she said at last. He always has. I've watched him for 3 years be exactly as charming and exactly as available and exactly as interested as the situation required. I'm not interested in being easy, and I'm not interested in being a conquest, and I'm not interested in, she stopped, in being wanted the way he wants things, which is easily and without it costing him anything. Sable looked at her for a long moment. Is that what you think it would be? It's what I've watched it be. With other people. Sable. I'm just saying, Sable said carefully, that you're very good at reading terrain and very defensive about reading people. And those are different skills. Rivas drained her tea. I have reports to write. You always have reports to write when you want to end a conversation. But she said it fondly, the way you say the truth to someone you love and have no intention of leaving behind. She spent the 3 days before the eastern boundary run doing the following things. Writing the full Stormridge scouting report, cross-referencing it with 6 months of patrol logs, running an interrogation of the 3 border wolves who had had the closest proximity to the incursion area, filing a supplementary intelligence assessment with her father's advisory council, training with the Southern Patrol in a series of exercises that left everyone involved sweaty and humbled, visiting her father's house for dinner, and enduring his pointed questions about her long-term plans with the practiced patience of a person who had been enduring pointed questions for 24 years, and had no intention of developing different plans. She did not think about Calder Voss. She was quite good at this. She had, as Sable had noted, been practicing it for a long time. The technique was not suppression. She had learned early that suppression was just delayed explosion, and she did not particularly care for explosions in any metaphorical sense, but compartmentalization. The building of solid mental walls between areas that were not to be mixed. The area labeled Calder Voss was well maintained, its walls regularly reinforced. She added to it occasionally a new observation, a new irritation, a new example of the competence that kept finding the gaps in her architecture, and then she sealed the addition and moved on. On the second day, she ran into him at the armory, where they were both returning equipment from the Stormridge check, and he said something quiet and sharp about the scout formation that was, again, exactly right, and she agreed in the same register, and they stood for 3 minutes discussing pack intelligence with the focused professionalism of two people who were good at their jobs, and then he left. And she stood there for a moment before reminding herself that she had places to be, and competence was not a virtue unique to him. On the third day, she found a sprig of late-season ash blossom tucked into the strap of her pack, where it couldn't have been placed by accident. Ash blossom smelled like cedar and cold water, the specific notes of early autumn in the Ashenwilde, and it bloomed on the north-facing slopes where good trackers went and casual walkers didn't. It had no note attached. It had no explanation. She stared at it for a long moment. She put it in the outer pocket of the pack rather than removing it, which was not a decision she was prepared to examine in any detail. They left at first light on the fourth day, in wolf form because the distance was better covered on 4 legs, and there was a specific quality to running beside Calder Voss that she had spent considerable effort not acknowledging, and was finding it more difficult not to acknowledge in the open morning forest with his wolf self visible in her peripheral vision. He was dark brown in his wolf form, large and ground-covering, with a white mark behind his left shoulder that she had noticed when they were both adolescents learning to run the territory, and had continued to notice since with the faithful consistency of a landmark. He didn't run with her characteristic ground-hugging stride, but with something longer and more deliberate, a lope that looked unhurried and covered distance at a rate that suggested the unhurried quality was more choice than limit. She ran ahead, and he didn't try to match her pace, and this was somehow more aggravating than being matched would have been. They were an hour into the eastern boundary, working the ridgeline above the creek-carved valley that formed the territory's natural eastern edge, when she found the first evidence of the new activity. It was subtle, she might have missed it if she'd been less focused, or less acquainted with the specific body language of old forest growth. A sapling oak, its bark scraped at the height of a standing wolf's shoulder. Not the random scratch of an animal passing the precise, deliberate marking of a boundary wolf communicating with another boundary wolf. The scrape bore a scent she didn't recognize, which meant it wasn't Thornvale, and it was fresh enough that she could still separate the individual components of it. Cold stone, pine. And something beneath those, something sharp and chemically specific that was the wolf equivalent of adrenaline. They had been afraid when they made this mark. She shifted human, crouched beside the tree, and Calder appeared beside her in human form 2 seconds later. "Stormridge," he said. "Yes, and scared. Look at the depth of the scratch. They went in hard, more pressure than a casual marking. When something is going wrong in the body leaves more evidence than it intends to. He crouched beside her, close enough that she could feel the warmth of his arm near hers, and looked at the scrape with the same careful attention. How old? 18 hours, less. She sat back on her heels. This isn't scouting anymore. No. His voice had changed, dropped to the register he used for serious assessments, less of the easy quality, more of the sharpness beneath it. This is advanced steam marking. They're identifying positions for something moving behind them. He paused. How far are we from the secondary spring, the one that's not on the official maps? She looked at him. How do you know about the secondary spring? I mapped this territory in my first year, all of it, including the parts that weren't on official maps. A slight pause. I don't do things by halves. She decided not to examine the specific quality of the look he gave her when he said this, and stood. 1/2 a mile north, she said. Then let's go. They went north through terrain that grew rougher. The eastern boundary here was the original wildland, the Ashenwilde at its most unmanaged, old growth and deadfall, and the kind of deep-root undergrowth that wanted to catch ankles. Reva moved through it with her characteristic absence of sound and effort. Calder moved behind her, and the sound he made was minimal for his size, not silent, as she was, but quiet in the practiced way of someone who had learned the skill rather than been born with it. They heard the Stormridge wolves before they smelled them. Not voices, no communication that simple. The sound of a body moving through undergrowth with more speed than care, which meant either panic or pursuit. Reva went still, and Calder went still behind her with an alignment of instinct that required no communication and was therefore, when she registered it, more unsettling than words would have been. Then the sound resolved into 2 bodies, not one, a chase. She processed the trajectory in less than a second. They were angling northwest, which meant they were going to cross the Thornvale boundary in approximately. She moved. She cut east at full wolf sprint before Calder had time to respond, taking the angle that would intercept the pursued rather than the pursuer, because whoever was running in the dark with that particular quality of desperate speed was the information source and not the threat. She covered the distance in the time it took the sound to become visible. A gray wolf, young by the scent, female, running with one rear leg carried awkwardly, the gait of something injured and going on adrenaline anyway. She cut across the young wolf's path at an angle that communicated stop without communicated attack. It was a particular skill, the body language of interception, and she was very good at it. And the gray wolf stumbled to a halt, spinning to face her with the frenetic readiness of something that had been running from something bad enough that another threat barely registered as a category change. Reva shifted human. Thornvale territory, she said, keeping her voice low and level. You're safe if you're not an enemy. The gray wolf shook exhaustion, adrenaline, pain, and shifted human. A girl, maybe 18, with blood on her arm where a wound was still fresh, and eyes that had the quality Reva had learned to recognize. The particular wide-open blankness of someone who had seen something they hadn't yet processed. Stormridge, the girl said. They're pushing the Ashenvale range. They pushed through our pack, our alpha. She stopped. Her face did something complicated. They took him. Behind Reva, Calder arrived, fully human, taking in the scene with a single rapid sweep. He looked at the girl's arm. He looked at Reva. Something passed between them, not words, not even the wolf-sense communication of pack mates, but something older and simpler. The shared intelligence of two people who had been in enough difficult situations to know which one of them was going to do which thing next. Rivam moved to crouch beside the girl and check the arm. Calder straightened, turned his back to them, and watched the undergrowth from which they'd come. He said nothing about this division of roles. Neither did she. They returned to Thornvale with the injured girl. Her name was Fail. She was from the Greywood Pack, the smallest pack on the Ashenvane Range's western face. And what followed was the particular organized chaos of a pack responding to the first clear sign of a conflict becoming something larger than a conflict. Lyra went into her crisp operational mode. Dren, Ravaz's father, convened the senior wolves with the speed of a man who had been waiting for some version of this news for 3 weeks. Maps came out. Voices rose and fell and were brought back to precise focus. Ravaz contributed her report, her assessment, and her recommendation, a full eastern boundary sweep before week's end, increased patrol frequency, no engagement without pack-authorized strength, and then removed herself from the meeting because she could, because tracker scouts were intelligence functions and not strategy functions, and she was not needed in the room. She walked to her house, which was a modest stone building near the eastern edge of the settlement, close to the forest in the practical way of someone who was in and out of the trees frequently enough to value proximity. She had built some of it herself, which her mother said explained why it had an idiosyncratic floor plan, and her mother was not wrong. She stood in the kitchen and thought about Fail's face when she said they took him, and felt the particular kind of anger that was less fire than weight, the anger at things that harm the helpless, at power used for the kind of purposes that required smaller things to suffer. She had always been better at this kind of anger than the hot, explosive kind. The hot kind burned through. This kind stayed, became fuel. She was thinking about the Stormridge advance markers and their formation pattern, and what it implied about numbers and intent when the light coming through the eastern window shifted. Full moon rising. She had forgotten. She was almost never in the settlement on the night of Selun's full moon. She usually spent it running the deep Ashenwilda, where the light came through the canopy in silver columns, and the whole forest was changed, transformed, made into something ancient and significant by the quality of what fell from the sky. But tonight, with Stormridge activity on the borders and an injured refugee in the healing house and strategy meetings running in the common hall, the gathering horn sounded from the common ground. Of course, the full Selun moon, even in times of tension, especially in times of tension. The pack gathered under the full moon because the pack always gathered under the full moon, because this was one of the things that the goddess had required of them since the first werewolf had lifted their face to the sky and felt the particular weight of the light. Gather. Remember what you are. Remember who holds you together. She went. The common ground at night under the full Selun moon was a different place from the common ground during the day. The training markers were cleared, the administrative buildings went dark, and the space became what it had always been beneath its practical surface, a sacred clearing, the place where the pack was a pack rather than a collection of working parts. A bonfire at the center. The elder women in a ring around it, the oldest ones leading the invocation that had been spoken in some version since the first pack gathered under the goddess's eye. The smell of burning cedar and the particular resin they threw on the fire for the ritual, which smelled like the Ashenwilda and like winter, and like something older than both. Rava found her place on the eastern side of the gathering, where she usually stood close enough to the elder women's ring to hear clearly, far enough from the crowd that she had space to breathe and see. Sable appeared at her shoulder without announcement or invitation, as she always did, and they stood together in the easy silence of people who had been standing in companionable silence at these gatherings for 15 years. The invocation began. The elder women's voices braided together, not harmony exactly, more like weaving, different threads of sound going over and under each other. The words were old enough that their original language had shifted into something almost unrecognizable, but the sounds had meaning below the semantic level, had meaning in the body rather than in the mind. Rava felt it the way she always felt it, a deepening, a settling, a sensation of the wolf self becoming more fully present, more awake beneath the human surface. The fire burned higher. The moon was full and perfectly clear, the sky having decided, in the way of mountain skis, to be absolutely without cloud on this particular night. She was listening to the second movement of the invocation, the nomming of the pack's dead, the acknowledgement of those who had been sent ahead into Selun's direct keeping, when the back of her neck went very warm. Not warm the way fire warmth works, spreading from a source. Warm the way a word lands when it's the word you needed, when it fills a space you had not previously noticed was empty. Specific and sudden and entirely different from anything she had felt before. She turned her head. Calder was standing on the south side of the fire, 20 feet away, and he was looking at her. Not the way he had ever looked at her before, or not quite that. He was looking at her with the same quality of attention she had always catalogued and filed and refused to examine too carefully. But it was larger now, more concentrated, stripped of the practiced ease that usually wrapped it. He was looking at her as if she were the only fixed point in the world and everything else was peripheral. As if he had just discovered she was fixed. She felt it happen before she understood what it was. The warmth on the back of her neck spread. Into her shoulders, down her spine, into her chest, where it settled with a weight that was not unpleasant, and was, in fact, the single most alarming sensation she had experienced in 24 years of being alive. Her wolf sense went loud, usually a baseline hum she was accustomed to ignoring, now a full presence sound, and beneath the general wolf sense something else, something she had never heard before, a resonance that seemed to be made of him and was entirely entwined with her own heartbeat before she had time to decide anything about it. The bond. She knew it the way she had known the forest since she was 6, immediately, completely, without the need for confirmation. The bond snapped into place like a lock closing, like a cord resolving, like the world splitting along a seam. And Calder Voss was across it. Her first response, immediate, visceral, before thought was involved, was to take a step back. Her second response was fury. Her third response was the horrible, unwanted, absolute recognition of something she had been refusing to name for 3 years, and which had now been named for her by the most fundamental force in the universe. She turned and walked into the forest. She did not run. Running was retreat. Walking was a choice. The distinction, she understood even in this moment, was almost entirely meaningless. She ran when the trees closed around her. She ran full wolf speed, which was the only kind of speed she had in this particular moment, because the alternative was stopping and feeling the thing that was happening in her chest, and she was not ready to stop and feel it. She ran south through the Ashenwilde, through the known trails and off them, through the undergrowth and over the deadfall and along the creek-carved valley that she had been running since she was old enough to be trusted in the dark, and the forest accepted her, as it always did, without judgment. She ran until the sensation was not smaller, but was at least familiar, until she had been running long enough that the physical effort had its own narrative, and the narrative was, I am moving, I am choosing, I am in my own body on my own terms. She stopped at the secondary spring, the one not on official maps, and stood in wolf form with her paws in the cold, shallow water and her nose working the night air and her heart doing something entirely unprecedented in her chest. The bond. She had felt it snap. She could still feel it, could not stop feeling it, which was the thing the elders left out of their careful songs, the thing that the romantic stories failed to capture in their version of the truth. The bond did not arrive and then sit quietly at the margin of perception, waiting to be acknowledged. It lived at the center. It was the single loudest thing in the world now, and the thing it was loud about was him, and she hated it with the comprehensive, helpless fury of someone who had built a very specific life on the premise of not needing it. She shifted human, sat on the cold bank, and put her face in her hands. She sat there for a long time. The moon moved overhead, full and patient. The water made its small, cold sounds. An owl said something definitive in the distance. When she lifted her face, the clarity that had arrived was not peace would come later, maybe, or never. She was not optimistic, but it was clarity. The analytical part of her brain, which was the largest and most reliable part, had come back online. Think, she told herself. Think about this like you think about terrain. What is the actual situation? The actual situation. The goddess Selun, whose understanding of the pack exceeded any individual wolf's comprehension, had decided that Riva Ashvane and Calder Voss were mates. The bond was real. She could feel it as clearly as she could feel her own heartbeat, which was, in fact, what it felt like, a second heartbeat alongside her own, different in rhythm but present, not going anywhere. He was not going anywhere. The actual situation. Calder Voss, who was powerful and arrogant and had spent 3 years being charming and easy with every woman who sought him out, who had never, not once, not in any conversation or situation she had observed given any indication that he felt anything for her beyond the specific quality of attention that she had spent 3 years explaining away, who had never said a word, who had spent 3 years not saying it, who had looked at her across the bonfire with all of his practiced ease stripped away, and something underneath it that she had not known how to read, because she had not allowed herself the practice. She thought about the ash blossom in her pack pocket. She thought about the fact that he'd known about the secondary spring. She thought about the way he turned his back to her and the injured girl and stood watch, without being asked, while she assessed the wound. The body language of someone who trusted you completely at your job and was making space for it. She buried her face in her hands again. Goddess, she said into the dark, not a prayer, an accusation. The moon continued to be full and patient overhead. She was back in the settlement by midnight, moving through the quiet with the controlled speed of someone who had made a decision. The gathering had dispersed. The fire had been banked. She went to her house, changed her clothes, sat at her table and wrote the following things. 1. A complete breakdown of the Stormridge intelligence, reformatted into the clear language summary she used for crisis reports. 2. A revised patrol schedule for the eastern boundary, incorporating the new activity data. 3. Nothing about the bond, because that was going into no document she had any intention of producing. She was on the third item, the one she wasn't writing when the knock came. She had known, in the way you know things when the bond is active and the source of the bond is within a quarter-mile of you, that he was coming from about 4 minutes out. She had used those 4 minutes productively. She had confirmed her expression, confirmed her position, seated, occupied with papers in control of the space, and confirmed her decision. The decision was no. She opened the door. Calder Voss in the moonlight, on her threshold, with none of the practiced ease and all of the thing that was beneath it. He was breathing normally and standing with the deliberate stillness of someone who had decided what to do with the energy coursing through him, which was visible, which she could feel across the bond as clearly as she could feel her own heartbeat, the twin percussion of it, his want and her refusal each adding sound to the other. He looked at her. She held the door. "No," she said. "A beat. I haven't said anything." "You were going to." "Were you going to listen if I did?" She felt against her will the corner of her mouth wanting to do something. She disciplined it. "I don't know what the goddess was thinking," she said. "But I do know that a feeling I didn't choose is not a decision. It does not commit me to anything. It does not change who I am or what I want, and what I want," she paused carefully, "is not to become the latest in your very long list of things that weren't complicated." Something moved in his face, something she had not expected, not the usual ease, not the charm, not even the sharpness she had seen when they worked together. Something older and less managed than any of those. "You think that's what you are to me," he said. "I think the bond makes me feel like something, and feelings can be honest without being accurate." He looked at her for a long moment. The bond hummed between them loudly, the way it had been humming since the common ground, and she felt every resonance of it and refused every resonance of it simultaneously, which was the most exhausting thing she had done in 24 years of doing exhausting things. "All right," he said, not yielding. The word landed differently from yielding. He said it the way someone says "I hear you" when they mean "I am not done." He stepped back from her threshold. "Good night, Reva." She closed the door. She stood on the inside of it for approximately 30 seconds before moving to the table and picking up her pen and writing nothing, because her hand wouldn't cooperate, and staring at the paper with the bond doing its persistent and infuriating work in her chest. She did not sleep well. The bond, as it turned out, did not care about her decision. She had understood this intellectually. The theory was clear. The bond was not consensual in the sense that no individual wolf consented to it, and it did not respond to the absence of consent by becoming less. It was a fundamental thing, older than pack law, older than the rites and the ceremonies that surrounded it. The goddess had made a decision at the level of the world's structure, and Reva's opinion of that decision was, from the goddess's perspective, entirely beside the point. Understanding this theoretically and experiencing it practically were, she was discovering, two entirely different events. She felt him all the time now. not in the sense of knowing his specific location or his specific thoughts. The bond at this early stage wasn't a constant open line, wasn't some invasive sharing of consciousness. It was more like having a compass that always knew where north was and couldn't be turned off. She had a constant low-register awareness of his general direction, and this was the part that disturbed her most, his general state. Whether he was calm or agitated, whether he was focused or distracted. The emotional weather of him, filtered through something she had no precise instrument for measuring. He was, for the first 3 days after the full moon, focused, very focused. She knew this the way you know a sound that you can't identify but can't stop noticing. As a quality in the background of everything, present even when she was fully occupied with other things. A low hum at the edge of awareness that told her there in the direction of wherever he was. She threw herself into work with the efficiency of someone using productivity as a blunt instrument against inconvenient feelings. She ran the Eastern boundary assessment she had been assigned, alone, having filed a request to go solo that Lyra accepted with the expressionless deliberateness of someone choosing not to comment. She ran the Stormridge intelligence data through 3 additional analysis passes and produced a report that Orin, who she ran into in the common hall dash, described as alarmingly thorough. She trained harder than was strictly necessary and ate well and slept as well as the bond would allow, which was less well than before but more than nothing. On the 4th day, she ran into Calder at the communal archive. She had gone to cross-reference an old territorial map with the new scouting data. He was already there, not at the map table where she needed to be, but in the adjacent section, working through the historical Stormridge incident records with the systematic quality she had observed in him before. He looked up when she came in. He held the look for exactly as long as was natural, then returned to his work. She went to the map table. She worked in silence for 20 minutes, and he worked in silence for 20 minutes, and neither of them said anything. And the archive was very quiet, and his presence was very loud in the particular way it had become loud since the full moon. The compass of him pointing directly at the adjacent section with tireless insistence. Ashenvane Range, he said, without looking up from his records. She looked up from the map. What about it? The Greywood Pack Fails Pack sits directly between Thornvale's eastern approach and Stormridge's expansion corridor. If Stormridge has pushed through Greywood, they don't just control the mountain passes. He tapped the record in front of him. They control the high ground. Any aggressive move into Thornvale territory comes from above, not below. The elevation advantage is enormous. She had thought of this. Of course she had thought of this. It was the first thing she had worked out when Fail described what had happened. But she looked at the map with the data laid in it, and she felt the particular calibration of working with someone whose instincts ran in the same direction as hers, who arrived at the same assessments by different means and thereby confirmed them. I know, she said. The high ground problem is the central issue, which means the eastern boundary run isn't enough. We need someone on the Ashenvane approaches before Stormridge consolidates. Agreed. He turned from the records to look at her directly. I want to propose it to Lyra. She'll need specifics, who, when, what the risk assessment looks like. I'll have the root analysis ready by tonight. And I'll have the historical context, 3 instances in the last century of packs using the Ashenvane high ground in territorial conflicts, what they did, what worked. He paused. We could combine them in one presentation, more efficient than two separate meetings. She looked at him. He looked back. The bond made its low, persistent sound. Fine, she said. She returned to the map. He returned to the records. The archive was quiet. But there was a quality to the quiet that was different from before. Less absence, more presence. The particular weight of two people working in parallel who have stopped pretending not to know each other. The joint presentation to Lyra that evening was good. She knew it was good while it was happening, knew it the way you know things when the work is functioning the way good work functions, with an internal logic that runs ahead of you and makes the next step obvious. He presented the historical pattern. She presented the current terrain analysis. They built the recommendation together in the kind of real-time synthesis that required both of them to be fully present and listening to the other. Lyra approved the Ashen Vein approach assessment with the full meeting decisiveness of a future alpha who had been waiting for this data to appear. I'll need 2 scouts on the approaches, fast and quiet, the kind of operation that can't become a provocation if Stormridge spots you. She looked between them. You both understand what that requires. Yes, Rava said. Yes, Calder said. Lyra paused for a beat that was probably entirely coincidental. Good. 3 days. Plan your route, share it with the border captains, and be back within a week. She turned to the next item on her list, which was the most effective way to close a conversation. Outside the receiving room, in the corridor, Rava and Calder stood briefly side by side before taking different directions. He spoke without looking at her, his voice pitched low, carrying only as far as her ears. I know what you decided. I'm not asking you to undecide it. She didn't answer. I'm asking you to work with me on this, the way you would work with anyone, because the pack needs this done well and we're the right people to do it. She looked at the stone wall of the corridor, where someone had scratched a small moon in the plaster some years ago, the kind of small anonymous mark that accumulated in inhabited places. I know we are, she said. Then that's all this is, he paused, for now. The for now landed like the end of a sentence that was also the beginning of another one. She walked away from it. The night before the Ashen Vein approach, Sable found her at the creek's edge. Sable had the particular gift of appearing exactly when she was needed with exactly no excess commentary, which was possibly her finest quality. She sat beside Rava on the bank without invitation or explanation, and they watched the water, and after a while Sable said, When did it happen? The full moon. I thought so. Sable was quiet. I watched you both. I thought I could feel it from where I was standing, but I wasn't sure if I was imagining it. You probably weren't. Rava picked up a stone and turned it in her fingers. Cold and smooth, shaped by the water over something like centuries. She stopped. It's extremely loud, she said at last, which was not what she had meant to say but was the most accurate available description. Sable made a sound of understanding. Did you talk to him? He came to my house. And I told him no. And what did he say? She thought about it. She thought about I hear you, I am not done, about I know what you decided about for now. He said all right, she said. And then he kept showing up. Not pursuing, not doing what I expected him to do. She paused. He keeps just being there, working, being competent and reasonable and... Good at his job in ways that you can't dismiss, Sable said. Yes, she threw the stone. It bounced 3 times on the water and sank. I prepared for him to be difficult. I prepared for the arrogant version, the entitled version, the you can't resist the bond version. She paused. He's being patient. Is patience not what you expected? From him, no. She was honest with herself about this, here in the dark by the creek with only Sable and the water and the stars to hear it. He has always seemed to me like a man who did not have to wait for things, who found the easy path because the easy path always presented itself to him. And now, she thought about the ash blossom, about the secondary spring, about the way he'd turned his back at the right moment, instinctively, without it being discussed. Now he is being something else, she said, and I don't know yet if that's the truth of him or the bond making something that isn't true feel real. She paused. That's the actual problem. That's why the answer is still no. Not because I don't, she stopped. She turned the stopped sentence over and looked at its underside. Then, because it was Sable and the dark and the creek. Not because I don't feel it, but because I don't know yet if what I feel is him or if it's the bond wearing his face. Sable was quiet for a long moment. Do you think there's a difference? I think there has to be. I think if there isn't, then the bond is just a cage with a nicer name. And I won't. Her voice dropped to its lowest register, the one that contained everything she wasn't going to perform for anyone, not even Sable. I will not be in a cage, not even one that the goddess built. Sable was quiet for a long time. Then she put her arm around Rivaz's shoulders in the way she had been doing since they were 6 years old, the warm and undemanding weight of someone who stayed. Then find out, she said. Take the time you need. Ask the questions you need to ask. Make it your choice. A pause. But Rivaz, don't let the refusal become the cage too. Rivaz leaned against her friend and looked at the water and thought, for the first time, about that possibility. About the difference between choosing not to do something and being trapped by the choosing. The creek ran cold and clear over the stones. Above them, the Ashenwilda was breathing. Selun does not make the bond easy. She makes it inevitable. The space between those two things is where you discover who you are. Elder Sen Whitecrest, spoken to the Thornvale gathering, year of the 3rd frost. They left before dawn. The pre-dawn was cold in the Ashenwilda in the way that late autumn cold was cold, not bitter, not aggressive, but settled and serious, the kind of cold that had decided to stay. Rivaz ran ahead in wolf form, and Calder ran at her left shoulder, which was not where he had been on previous runs. Previously, he had run at her flank, a half-step behind, which she had noticed and had not commented on because acknowledging that she noticed his precise position relative to her body at all times was not something she was prepared to do in those previous runs. At her shoulder was different. At her shoulder was even, parallel, neither ahead nor behind. She didn't comment on this either. They ran for 2 hours through the Ashenwilda and out the other side, into the territory that was less familiar to her, the transitional land between Thornvale's managed woodland and the wild high ground of the Ashenvane Range's western approaches. The landscape changed as they climbed, the dense old growth thinning, the soil growing shallower and stonier, the trees giving way to pine, and then to the gnarled, wind-shaped scrub that marked the timberline. Above the scrub, the rock. She shifted human at the first ridge overlook, where the approach to the Ashen Vein's western face was visible in its full extent, and crouched to read the ground. He shifted human beside her. They had not spoken since Thornvale. There had been nothing necessary to say that couldn't be communicated in the compact language of direction and pace, and the silence between them on the rock had a different quality from the silence in the archive. Less avoidance. More the silence of two people who were attending to the same thing and didn't need to narrate it. "Movement signs," she said, reading the slope. 3 days old at least. See the way the frost has grown across the track. It's been through 2 cold cycles since something heavy went through. He crouched beside her and looked. Stormridge. Too early to say. Could be Greywood survivors moving west. Could be game. She straightened. I want to go further up, to the second ridge. It'll put us in visual range of the Ashen Vein passes. Yes. He looked at her, which means anyone in the passes could see us. It's scouting. Risk is the entrance fee. She held his gaze steadily, waiting for the challenge. It didn't come. He simply turned and looked at the slope assessment with a competent focus she had been trying not to be impressed by. Then we stay low and use the scree, he said. There's a ledge system on the north face that should give us cover to the second ridge without silhouetting. She looked at the north face. He was right. She had been about to take the south approach, which was faster but more exposed. She weighed the options with the cold clarity she applied to risk assessment and found his route better. North face, she agreed. They went. It took longer. The scree was technical, requiring precise foot placement and the particular patience of moving over unstable ground without panicking it into movement. But they reached the second ridge unseen, as far as she could tell, by anything except the ravens that worked the updrafts above the passes and regarded everything with their complete and amiable indifference. From the second ridge, the view was devastating in its clarity. The Ashen Vein passes lay out before them in the thin mountain light. 3 main passages through the range, each carved by glacial action 10,000 years ago and contested by various packs for most of the time since. And in the central pass, the widest, the most navigable, the most strategically valuable movement. Not the movement of game or individuals. The organized, deliberate movement of a significant group. Stormridge. She could smell them faintly even at this distance, the sharp mineral-cold pack scent that was distinct from anything in her own experience. She counted again, she looked at Calder. He was already counting. His jaw was set in the way it had been in the archive when he was reading the historical records, not tense, but focused with a quality that was something like anger held very still. 40, she said quietly. At least, that's what's visible. He shifted his weight slightly on the ledge, adjusting his angle for a clearer view of the pass's far side. There are shadows in the eastern approach another group, smaller. She looked, he was right. She had missed it, focused on the larger group. Flanking formation, she said. They've done this before. Stormridge's Ashen Vein campaign 20 years ago, he said. Same structure. Central force visible, flanking units in the shadows. They want to be seen. The main force is meant to be seen. It draws attention while the flankers position. She looked at him. He was looking at the pass, his profile against the mountain sky, and she had a sudden clear image of him in the archive, moving through the historical records with that same systematic attention, and she understood that he had prepared this. had specifically gone back through the old records to be ready for exactly what he was looking at now. He had prepared because he thought this might happen. He had been thinking ahead, carefully, with the kind of thoroughness that did not announce itself. The ash blossom, she thought again. We need to get this back to Lyra, she said, keeping her voice even. Yes. He looked at her then, and the focused distance of the assessment was replaced by the specific quality of his attention when it was directed at her, which was, she had to admit to herself alone on this cold ledge, different, warmer and more particular than his general competence. And Reva. Don't. I was going to say, he continued, as if she hadn't spoken, that you should take the lead on the briefing. You know the terrain better, your analysis is cleaner, and Lyra trusts your reads more than mine. She looked at him. The bond hummed between them. He held her gaze with the directness that was his particular quality, not challenging, not performing, just entirely present. All right, she said. Was that so hard? She turned from the ledge. We should move. Riva, not demanding, just her name again with that weight on it. What I said the other night about for now, I meant it honestly, not as a threat. She stopped with her back to him. The wind off the range was cold and clean, and she breathed it deliberately. I know, she said. She turned to look at him over her shoulder, a compromise she was willing to make, the halfway position between full engagement and leaving. I'm figuring out what I think about it. He nodded once. A single, serious nod, the kind that meant I heard you without layering anything else on top of it. They descended the north face together. The thing about the bond that nobody wrote in the ceremonies, or the songs, or the rites was this. It was most present in the dark. Riva had not slept well since the full moon, which was the fault of the bond rather than of conscience or anxiety. She slept, she woke. She felt the low, resonant awareness of his direction and his state in her chest and her wolf sense, and the waking felt less like waking from sleep than like surfacing into the bond's particular noise. It was not intrusive in the way of thoughts. It wasn't words, wasn't images, wasn't the invasive sharing of consciousness. It was more textural than that. More the quality of a room than the content of a conversation. She woke at 2 in the morning of the 4th night of the Ashen Vein approach to the bond, telling her something was wrong. Not wrong in the sense of danger, not the alarm register that the wolf sense used for physical threat. Wrong in the sense of distress. The low, persistent warmth that was his constant note had gone tight, wound around itself, the way breathing sounds when someone is managing something too large to manage lying down. She lay still for approximately 2 minutes, telling herself that his distress was not her responsibility, that the bond's reporting function did not obligate her to respond to the report, that being aware of his state was not the same as needing to do anything about his state. Then she got up. She found him at the edge of the camp they'd made in a sheltered rock hollow, not in his bedroll, but sitting at the camp's outer edge with his back to the rock and his elbows on his knees and his eyes on the passes, which were dark and quiet at 2 in the morning. He heard her coming. He didn't move or look up, just shifted slightly on the rock to make space beside him. She sat, not close, a reasonable distance. The distance of 2 colleagues sharing a watch, which was the interpretation she was prepared to defend if required. I wasn't going to wake you, he said. You didn't. He looked at her then, and there was something in his face that she had not seen in the catalog of his expressions she had been building for years. Not the easy charm, not the focused competence, not even the stripped-down directness she had seen on her threshold the night after the full moon. This was older than any of those, more basic. The expression of someone sitting with something true at 2 in the morning when there was no reason to perform anything. Fail said her alpha was taken, he said. Not killed, taken. She had been thinking about this since the Greywood girl said it. Leverage, she said. Against his pack, against anyone who might challenge the expansion. He was quiet. What Stormridge is doing isn't territorial dispute, it's conquest. Methodical, patient, using hostages as infrastructure. His voice was level, but she could feel through the bond the thing underneath the level. A kind of outrage that had the same quality as hers, the weight anger, the fuel anger. I've seen this in the historical records. Once a pack consolidates the high ground with this method, unpicking it costs, he stopped. It costs the people they use as leverage. I know. Does Lyra know the full scope? She will when we brief her. She paused. It changes the strategy. It changes everything. He ran his hand through his hair, the gesture of someone working through something too large for a clean solution. We can't just respond to incursions. We need to go above the ridge line before they're entrenched. And to do that, he paused. We need allies, the other small packs in the range, Greywood survivors, the Ironcliff wolves if they'll come. This can't be Thornvale alone. She looked at him in the dark. He was thinking 4 moves ahead, and the 4 moves were the right 4 moves, and she had the sudden clear thought that the pack had been planning to make him beta for a long time, and the pack was right. She had known this abstractly. She knew it now in a more personal way, which was uncomfortable. I'll add the alliance assessment to the briefing, she said. I'll write the historical precedent section, packs that have successfully coordinated against consolidating aggressors. He paused. There aren't many, but there are some. They sat together in the cold dark for a while. The passes were silent. The stars were very numerous and very clear, the mountain sky doing its specific thing of making the rest of the world feel temporary by comparison. Why are you awake? She said. Not what's wrong, she already knew what was wrong, not demanding anything, just asking. He was quiet for a moment. I think about the people in the path of it, he said. The small packs, the ones like Greywood, the ones who are just living, being a pack, taking care of their people, and then something larger with more power decides they're in the way. He paused. I've always hated that, the logic of the powerful over the small. He stopped. His voice had gone to a lower register, less controlled than usual, the 2 in the morning version. My mother's pack was absorbed when I was 7, not by force, by a political merger that the adults called a good decision and that the children called losing everything familiar. He was looking at the passes, not at her. The Voss family integrated well. My mother always said we were fortunate, but I remember, he stopped again. I remember being small and watching everything change and not having any say in any of it. She sat with this. It was not what she had expected him to say. It was not what the version of him she had constructed would have said. The version she had constructed was comfortable with power, accustomed to it, unaffected by its complications. This version had been 7 years old and watched everything familiar dissolve. I didn't know that, she said, carefully, not performing anything, just stating it the way you state a simple fact. You didn't ask, he said. not as an accusation, as the plain truth of a thing. She had not asked. She had watched him from a distance and constructed him from observation and inference, and had never, not once, asked him a direct question about himself that didn't pertain to Pack business. She sat with this too. "Why did you choose Thornvale?" she said. He was not originally from here. She had known this, had filed it in the Calder Voss section of her mind without examining it closely. He had come to Thornvale at 16, in the year before she began noticing the Cedaran Darkearth smell of him. Dren offered the beta position in the succession, he said, to train under the outgoing beta and build toward the role. A pause. But that wasn't the whole reason. She looked at him. He was looking at the mountain sky. "The Ashenwilde," he said. "I grew up on the plains. Open country, long sightlines, the kind of landscape where you can see everything coming from a long way away." He was quiet for a moment. "When I came to Thornvale for the evaluation, I ran the Ashenwilde for the first time. The density of it, the closeness of the trees, the way the light worked through the canopy, the way everything had roots going down for centuries." He paused. "I wanted to be a part of something with roots that deep." Rival looked at the mountain sky. She had always known, on some level, that her love for the Ashenwilde was not ordinary, that the forest was not just her workplace, but something she was made from, the way people are made from the places they grow up in. She had never heard anyone else describe it the way he just had. "It's the best forest in the range," she said. "I know. I've run every forest in the range." "I haven't, but I've run this one enough to know I don't need to." They sat in silence for a while. It was a different silence from the ones before, not absence, not avoidance, not the managed space of two people maintaining distance. It was the silence of two people who have just exchanged something real and are sitting with the weight of having done so. She became aware that the cold had reached the point of being genuinely cold, and that at some point in the last few minutes, the reasonable space between them had become slightly less reasonable, and that she was not as bothered by this as she should be. "You should sleep," she said. "We have rough terrain tomorrow." "So should you." "I'll take the watch." He looked at her, the dark-eyed steadiness of him that she had been refusing to look at directly for 3 years, and was currently looking at directly because it was 2 a.m. and she was tired, and the bond was loud, and she was out of energy for avoidance. "You don't have to do that," he said. "I know, I want to." He held her gaze for a moment, reading her, the way he read terrain, without pressure, with the patience of someone who understood that some information arrived in its own time. Then he nodded. "Wake me in 2 hours," he said. She turned to the passes, and he went back to his bedroll, and the night was cold and quiet, and the bond was loud in the way it was always loud now. And she sat with it and the mountain sky, and thought about everything she had constructed and everything it might have missed. They briefed Lyra 4 days later, back in Thornvale, and the briefing landed like a stone in still water. The concentric rings of consequence spreading outward from the moment Rival laid out the pass formation, and Calder laid out the historical precedent. Lyra listened with the quality of listening she had when something was both worse than expected and exactly what she had been preparing for. Alpha Dren, invited to the second half of the briefing, sat with his hands folded and his face still, and his eyes doing the work of processing an intelligence assessment that had redefined the scale of what Thornvale was facing. "Alliance," Lyra said when they finished. With the small packs of the Ashen Vein range's western and southern faces, Calder said. The Greywood survivors, they have territory knowledge that's invaluable. The Ironcliff Pack, if they're willing, they control the second strongest high position on the range. And the Merville Wolves in the southern passes, though they're alpha, he paused diplomatically. Difficult, Rivas said without the diplomacy. Particular in his requirements, Calder said. We need Rivas at the Merville meeting, Lyra said. He respects directness. He respects people who aren't afraid of him, Rivas said, which is a different thing. In his case, the same thing. Lyra looked between them. You two will lead the outreach. Rivas for the initial contact. She reads pack dynamics well, and she won't be politically managed. Calder for the negotiation once there at the table. He's better at finding what people want before they've named it and building from there. She paused. Objections. Rivas had several categories of objection, and all of them were, she recognized with the clear-eyed honesty that was one of her better qualities, entirely personal. She filed them and said, no. Good. Lyra closed her notes with the finality of someone who had made the decisions and was now interested in the execution. Father will handle the internal politics. I'll manage the border captains. You too, she looked at them. You're the team on this. Outside, walking away from the receiving room through the low autumn light, Rivas felt the word settle. Team. Not partnership with its personal weight. Not assignment with its temporariness. Team, which implied a structure, a duration, a mutual orientation toward something larger than either of them. She thought about the Rock Hollow camp, and the 2 in the morning conversation, and the Ashenwilde, and what he'd said about roots. She thought about what she'd said to Sable. Don't let the refusal become the cage, too. Calder, she said. He stopped and turned. They were in the path between the common hall and the eastern quarter, where the late afternoon light came long and low, and made the stone of the old buildings look warmer than they were. I want to ask you something, she said, and I need you to answer it honestly, not strategically. He looked at her steadily. No performance, no charm, just attention. All right. The 3 years before the full moon, she said. The women, the pack socials, the delegates, the all of it. She held his gaze. Were you running from something or toward something? The question landed with more weight than she had intended, or perhaps exactly the weight she had intended. She watched it arrive in him, watched his expression do something careful, and then do something honest, the sequence of a person deciding to tell the actual truth. Running from, he said, from the fact that I wanted something I was afraid of wanting, something that he paused, something that would require more of me than I was sure I had to give, that could see me clearly enough to know when I was performing and would call it out. He paused again. You scare me. She looked at him. It's not weakness. I don't mean it that way. He looked away for a moment, across the path toward the forest edge, and then back. I mean that wanting someone who is exactly as difficult as I am, exactly as proud, exactly as unlikely to be impressed by the surface version, that's terrifying. Because it means if it fails all the way down. There's no comfortable shallowness to retreat to. She stood in the autumn light and heard this and felt it enter, through every defense she had built, with the unfair ease of something true. You never said any of it, she said. No, he stopped, A rueful quality entered his expression, less like an apology and more like the acknowledgement of a failure he had already spent time with. I was a coward about it. I will tell you that honestly. I ran after easier things because they were easier and didn't require me to be exactly what I am at full volume. He met her eyes again. I'm not doing that anymore. She looked at him for a long moment. I know, she said finally. And she walked away, but differently from before. Not northeast when he was south. Just onward toward her house, with the particular quality of a person who is no longer carrying a weight in the same direction. The alpha of the Thornvale Pack was a large, gray-muzzled wolf named Bren Castor, who had led his pack for 30 years through a series of conflicts that had sharpened him, over time, into something that was less a person than a set of conclusions. He had the specific danger of leaders who had been right too many times, the certainty of the regularly vindicated, the impatience with uncertainty that came from a long track record of resolving it. He received Riva and Calder in his great hall, a low-beamed, fire-lit room with the accumulated weight of 3 decades of difficult decisions in every stone of it. And he looked at them with the assessing eyes of someone who sorted everything that walked through his door into useful or not useful, and acted accordingly. Riva let him look. She had been looked at by assessors all her life, and had learned that the correct response was the same as the correct response to being tracked by a predator in the wild. Stillness, confidence, and the absence of anything that read as either fear or aggression. Castor looked at her for a long moment and then said, "You're Dren's second daughter." "Yes." "Not the Alpha's heir." "No. But you're the one he sent. I'm the one who can tell you what's in the ashen vein passes without needing to hedge it to protect someone else's political position," she said. "And you're someone who needs to know that without the hedge." Castor looked at her for another moment. Then something in his face shifted, not a smile, nothing that relaxed, but a recognition. "Show me what you've got," he said. She showed him. She laid out the scouting data, the pass formation, the numbers, the historical pattern, what it meant for the small packs of the Ashen Vein Range's western face, and what it would mean for Merville when it reached the southern passes, not if, when. She spoke with the clean precision of the scout's report, nothing extra, nothing softened, everything exact. Castor listened. He asked 4 questions, all of them sharp and practical, and Riva answered all 4 without equivocation. Then he turned to Calder. "You have the precedent," he said, not a question. 3 instances, Calder said. 2 failed, 1 succeeded. The one that succeeded used alliance coordination and divided the aggressor's attention across multiple fronts simultaneously. He paused. The critical element was timing. The alliances that were built while the aggressor was still consolidating, before they were entrenched, had enough flexibility to choose the engagement. The ones that formed after the entrenchment didn't have the luxury of choosing, Castor said. "No." Castor looked at them both. He was quiet for a long time, the quiet of a person running calculations that had been 30 years in the making. Then, "What do you need from Merville?" The meeting went for 3 hours. Riva did not soften anything. Castor did not request softening. Calder found, with the particular gift she was beginning to understand as characteristic, the specific thing that Merville needed, not security, which was the obvious offer, but parity. The explicit inclusion of Merville's strategic assessment in the combined alliance planning, the acknowledgement that Castor's 30 years of Ashen Vein knowledge was not a supplementary asset but a central one. Castor committed Merville to the Alliance before they left. In the narrow street outside his hall, in the cold night air of the southern approaches, Rivas stopped and allowed herself a single moment of satisfaction. Not victory, it was too early for victory, but the particular satisfaction of a thing done well. "The parody angle," she said. "How did you know that was the key?" Calder was quiet for a beat. He's a man who has been right for 30 years and has spent 30 years watching people try to manage that rather than use it. He doesn't want to be handled. He wants to be taken seriously as an equal. He's not going to be an equal in the Alliance. No, but right now he needs to believe it's possible. He looked at her. And it is more possible than most alliances allow. He has information nobody else has. She looked at him in the dark street with the mountain cold pressing down on them both. "You're good at people," she said. Not a compliment exactly, an assessment. An acknowledgement of a data point that had been in her file for years and that she was now choosing, consciously, to take out and examine in the open. He met her eyes. There was something in his expression she had not seen before, not quite surprise, but the expression of someone receiving something they had been careful not to reach for. "You're saying that like it cost you something." "It costs me nothing," she said. "I'm factual about things I observe." "Is that what you are?" "Always." She turned toward the road north. "Let's move. We have the Ironcliff contact tomorrow and I want to sleep before we cross the high pass." He fell into step beside her, at her shoulder, level. "Rivas," he said. "Ahem. Thank you for asking me the question the other day and for listening to the answer." She walked for a few steps in the silence that was, she was beginning to recognize, different from all her previous silences with him. "Don't thank me for basic fairness," she said. "I'm not thanking you for basic fairness. I'm thanking you for giving me the chance to be honest when it would have been easier not to." A pause. "Those aren't the same thing." She didn't answer. But the compass warmth of the bond registered, with its relentless accuracy, the shift in the temperature of the space between them. The high pass crossing took 6 hours, starting at midnight to beat the dawn winds that made the upper sections impassable for a significant portion of the day. They ran it in wolf form, which was both faster and safer on the technical sections, and emerged on the other side into the high cold of the Ironcliff approach, as the first light was turning the sky above the eastern peaks from black to the specific blue-gray that preceded dawn. They rested in the shelter of a rock overhang, waiting for the Ironcliff scouts who would have been sent to meet them. Lyra had sent a runner 3 days earlier, and in the particular exhausted post-effort quiet that followed 6 hours of difficult terrain. "Tell me something," Rivas said, without planning to say it. She was sitting against the overhang with her knees up and her head tipped back against the cold stone, watching the sky lighten. Calder was sitting a few feet away in a similar posture. "What kind of something?" "Something I don't know." She paused. "Not about pack business, something about you." A beat, she could feel his surprise through the bond, the small spike of it, quickly resolved into something warmer. "Something you don't know," he said, considering. "That's an interestingly low bar from someone who's been observing me for 3 years." "I've been observing your professional performance for 3 years. I don't know much beyond that." I know about the secondary spring. That tells me you work harder than you let on, which isn't a something I don't know because I suspected it. She looked at the sky. A real something. He was quiet for a moment. She heard him shift his weight on the rock. I make furniture, he said. She looked at him. In the off hours, when I'm not on pack business, when I'm not training, I have a workshop at the back of my house. He wasn't looking at her, looking at the overhangs in her curve, where the rock showed the layered strata of its deep history. Tables, mostly, chairs, things with joints, with the kind of structure that has to solve a problem rather than just hold its shape. I find it, he paused. I find it satisfying in a way that's hard to explain. Something about the material having its own nature, and you working with it rather than against it. She stared at him. She had walked past his house hundreds of times. She had never noticed a workshop. I don't advertise it, he said, and there was a quality in his voice that was mild but awareness of having said something that was genuinely private, the exposedness of it, offered deliberately. It doesn't fit the image. What image? The power and arrogance one. He said it without self-pity, acknowledging it as cleanly as she would have acknowledged one of her own less flattering qualities. I know how I come across. I know what people think when they look at me, generally. The furniture is, he paused. It's mine in a way that doesn't have anything to do with the pack structure or the role or any of it. Just me and the wood and a problem to solve. She thought about this. She thought about the quality of care she had seen in his work on the territorial records, on the Merville meeting, on the 2 in the morning conversation about small packs and hostages, and the rage of the powerful over the small. The quality of someone for whom thoroughness was a value for its own sake, not a performance of diligence. The ash blossom, she said. He looked at her. In my pack strap, the morning before we went north, she held his gaze. That was you. He didn't deny it. You'd been on the north-facing slopes. I knew you'd notice it. What was it supposed to mean? He was quiet for a moment. Nothing strategic, he said. Nothing with intent. I was on the north-facing slopes the day before when I read the Stormridge markers again, and I found a sprig of late-season bloom, and I thought. He stopped. He looked at her with something entirely unguarded. I thought about you noticing it, that's all. She sat with this. The sky was lightening steadily. Below them, the Ironcliff approach was becoming visible in the gray, pre-dawn the rock and thin soil scrub of the high approaches, the suggestion of a structure in the distance that was probably the Ironcliff outpost. To the east, the mountains were gaining their shapes back from the dark. I've been seeing your threads in the Ashenwilde for years, she said after a while. The places you've been, the things you've looked at. How do you mean? Tracks, marks, the secondary spring, the north-facing slopes, the particular rock outcrop above the old quarry where someone spent an afternoon looking at the valley and left a boot print in the moss that didn't wash out for a month. She paused. I always knew they were yours. I couldn't have said how I knew, but I did. He was very still. I pretended not to notice, she said. It was easier. Was it? His voice was very quiet. No, she said honestly, not particularly. Below them, the sound of Ironcliff scouts crossing the approach. 3 sets of feet, confident, knowing the terrain, coming to meet them. Rivas stood, rolled her shoulders, became again the pack representative, the intelligence officer, the woman with a task. The comfortable armor of purpose, which she wore better than most. But before she stepped out from the overhang, she looked at him one more time. "Later," she said, not a promise, not a commitment, an acknowledgement that this, whatever this was becoming, had a later, and that she was not running from it. He looked at her with the unguarded quality she was beginning to recognize as his most honest face, the one that lived beneath the arrogance and the ease and the professional certainty. He nodded. They went to meet the Ironcliff wolves. The Ironcliff Alpha was a woman named Cora Thane, 50 years old, iron-gray hair, the kind of physical presence that had nothing to do with size and everything to do with what lived behind the eyes. She received them with the directness of high-altitude people who did not have the energy to spare for elaborate social machinery and therefore had never developed it. She had received Lyra's message. She had been watching the passes. She already knew most of what they brought, which was the quality of a border pack whose survival had always depended on knowing things before they were officially known. "The question isn't whether to join the alliance," Cora Thane said, 40 minutes into the meeting, "because we're already in the fight whether we choose it or not. The question is command structure. I don't fight under Thornvale. I fight with Thornvale. That's not negotiable." "Lyra said to tell you that command structure is determined by the coalition and not by pack hierarchy," Calder said. "She's willing to put that in writing before the first coordinating meeting." Cora Thane looked at him with the specific attention of someone assessing how much of what they're hearing is what they're being told and how much is the subtext beneath it. Then she looked at Riva. "You agree with this?" "I think it's the only structure that works," Riva said. "A hierarchical command in a multi-pack coalition is a liability. Every decision has to pass through a single point, and single points fail under pressure." She paused. "You bring Ironcliff's high-ground knowledge and mountain tactics. Thornvale brings territory intelligence and numbers. Merville brings 30 years of reading Stormridge specifically. The coalition commands by function, not by precedence." Cora Thane was quiet for a moment. Then, "Your sister chose well, sending you too." "We chose each other," Riva said, without planning to say it. The sentence landed. She felt it land and felt Calder go very still beside her and did not look at him. "Good," Cora Thane said. "That matters more than most things." She opened the record book on her table. "Let's talk specifics." They stayed one night at Ironcliff, in the pack's guest quarters, 2 separate rooms, no conversation about the arrangement. Riva lay in the thin mountain dark and thought about what she had said. We chose each other. It had been accurate as a statement of the coalition structure. It had also been something else under the surface, and she had heard the something else in her own voice as she said it, and had been unable to unsay it. The bond was quieter here, at altitude, as if the physical distance from Thornvale had turned the volume slightly down on everything. Not gone, never gone. She was beginning to understand that gone was not a category that applied to the bond, but lower, more manageable. Without the bond's noise, she could hear herself more clearly. What did she actually think? Not what she had decided, not what was safe to decide. What did she actually think in the quiet of a mountain night, stripped of the architecture of refusal she had spent years constructing? She thought, "He is not who I built him to be." She thought, "He is worse in some ways." The arrogance was real. The ease with which he ran from things that cost him, those were real qualities that she had not invented. But they were specific qualities in a specific person who also had other, less managed qualities. The thoroughness, the historical memory, the furniture in the back of the house, the secondary spring, the ash blossom, the fact that at 7 years old he had watched everything dissolve and had grown up into someone who chose a forest because it had deep roots. She thought, the bond is not wearing his face. His face is his face. The bond didn't put it there. The bond just made me unable to keep looking away. And then, with the clear-eyed honesty of someone who had always been better at examining the terrain of her own mind than the terrain of her own feelings, she thought, I have been in love with him for years. I have been in love with the pieces of him that I could see through the careful distance I maintained, and I have been furious about it, and the bond didn't create the love. The bond created the crisis. She lay in the dark and held this knowledge and waited to see what it would do to her. It did not feel like defeat. It felt, surprisingly, more like the moment at the top of a difficult climb when you finally have the full view, terrifying and clarifying simultaneously. The kind of knowing that doesn't simplify anything but does, at least, mean you know what you're dealing with. She would tell him nothing tonight. But tomorrow, on the road back through the high pass, she thought she might ask him something else. Something real, something that wasn't pack business. She asked him, in the gray dawn of the high pass, whether he had been afraid when he first ran the Ashenwilder alone. He looked at her in the thin morning light, and the something unguarded was there immediately, the face beneath the face. Yes, he said, not of the forest, of he considered, of not being enough for it, of running a forest that had been run by people who belonged to it for generations, and knowing I was new to it, and not being sure I'd earned the right to love it the way I already did. She ran beside him, not wolf form. They were on the human walkable section of the approach, the boulder field below the technical section, and thought about this. Did you ever feel like you earned it? When you stopped going around me in the Ashenwilder, he said. She looked at him sharply. I know you went around me for a long time. His voice was level, neither accusing nor performing forgiveness of a sin she hadn't committed. When the wind brought me your direction, when your tracks were on trails you didn't usually use, I knew you were routing around my presence. And when you stopped, he paused. About 6 months before the full moon, you stopped, started using the direct routes again. A pause. I figured you'd decided I wasn't worth the avoidance energy. That's approximately what happened, she said. I'll take it. She was quiet for a few steps. The pass was gray and cold, and the first high wind of the morning was beginning to move across the boulder field, carrying the smell of higher altitude and ice. Did it bother you, the avoidance? Yes. No qualification, no performance. It bothered me more than anything else about the whole situation bothered me, which should tell you something about how completely I had fooled myself into thinking I had it under control. She thought about this for some time. The boulder field gave way to a section of flat, fast gravel, and she picked up the pace and he matched it, and they ran in the particular silence of two people working through something large that was also very simple. I have been, she said at last, deeply unfair to you in one specific way. He looked at her. I built a version of you and I responded to the version instead of to you. She kept her eyes on the path, not avoiding his gaze, just looking where she was going. The version I built was simpler and more dismissible than you are. I used it to protect myself from something I didn't want to feel, and I pretended the version was accurate because it was convenient." She paused. That was unfair. He was quiet for a long enough moment that she glanced at him. He was looking at the path, expression thoughtful in the way she had come to recognize as him processing something rather than performing a response. "And was the version wrong about everything?" he said. "Or just some things?" "Not everything," she said honestly. "The arrogance is real. The way you move through a room like you've already decided you're welcome is real. The 3 years of chasing easy things rather than the difficult one," she paused. "Real." "Yes," he said, not defensive, not apologetic, just, "Yes, those things are true." "But the version didn't include the workshop," she said, "or the secondary spring, or Fail's alpha and the rage you felt about it, or the way you mapped the Ashenwilde including the parts that weren't on official maps." She paused. "Or the ash blossom." They ran in silence for a while. "What do you want to do with all of this?" he said. The question was careful, not demanding an answer, not moving toward anything specific, genuinely asking. She had been thinking about this since the mountain night. She had arrived at something that was not a plan. She was not ready for a plan, but was a direction, which was what you needed on difficult terrain. "I want to know you," she said. "Not the version I built, you, the actual person." She paused. "I don't know yet what I want to do with what I find out, but I want to know." He looked at her. The morning light was coming stronger now, the pass opening up ahead into the wide sky of the eastern ashen vein approaches, and the light caught his face in the way it had caught it on the ridge above the eastern boundary, warmer than expected, with more in it than the distance she had maintained had allowed her to see. "I can work with that," he said. And impossibly, unexpectedly, she felt herself begin to smile. The 3 weeks that followed were the kind of weeks that remake a person not through single large events, but through the accumulation of many small ones, each insufficient on its own, but collectively constituting something significant. Rivat and Calder built the alliance. They traveled to 4 pack territories, held 7 meetings, negotiated 3 points of genuine conflict, and coordinated a preliminary response strategy that Lyra would later describe as the most sophisticated non-military defensive structure Thornvale had produced in 40 years. They did this together, with the functional ease of 2 people who had discovered that they worked well together not despite their differences, but because of them. Her precision and his people reading, her terrain knowledge and his historical synthesis, her directness and his patience. It was not smooth. There were 3 arguments of substance about risk tolerance, about how much to tell the Merville wolves about Thornvale's defensive vulnerabilities, about a proposed deception tactic that Rivat considered elegant and Calder considered unnecessarily dangerous. And the arguments were fierce and direct, and neither of them backed down until the actual merits of the position were clear. And then the one who was wrong said so, and they moved on. She won 2, he won 1. After the 3rd argument, in which she conceded that his risk assessment had been more accurate than hers, they sat in the cold outside the Merville outpost in the late afternoon light, and there was a silence that was, by now, a very particular kind of silence, the kind that contained a great deal without needing to express any of it. "You're a good strategist," he said. "So are you. You're better at reading terrain, and I'm better at reading people," he said. "We're not competing." "I know that," she said, I've always known that. She paused. It took me a long time to know it about myself and not just intellectually. He looked at her with the clear, steady regard that was. She understood by now just how he looked at her, the baseline attention he gave her that was different from how he looked at anything else. Is it strange for you, the way we work together? Strange how? You've always worked alone. Not always, she paused, but usually. She thought about it, about the weeks of running beside him, arguing with him, building something with him that neither of them could have built alone. It's not what I expected, she said honestly. I expected it to feel like accommodation, like giving something up. She paused. It doesn't feel like that. What does it feel like? She looked at the mountain light on the Merville rock face. Like working with better tools than I had before, she said, which is uncomfortable to admit. He made a sound that was almost a laugh. You're allowed to find working with someone useful without it being a confession of weakness. I know that intellectually, but not yet practically. I'm working on it. He was quiet for a moment. For what it's worth, he said, you are also better tools than I had before. He paused. And you are also deeply uncomfortable to admit. She looked at him. He was looking at the mountains, and the corner of his mouth was doing the small, unperformed version of the smile she had been cataloging, the one he appeared to reserve specifically for her, and she felt the bond do its persistent work, and for the first time in weeks did not immediately file it under irrelevant. She left it where it was. She sat with it. I know you've been patient, she said. I know the bond is, she paused. I know it's not easy, what I've been asking. You haven't asked me for anything, he said. You've told me what you need, that's different. He looked at her. I told you, I know what you decided. I'm not asking you to undecide it. I'm asking you to keep letting me be present, which is all I've wanted. Why, she said. Actually, honestly, why me before the bond, before any of this? Why was it always me, when I was the one person who was making it clearly not going to be easy? He was quiet for a long time, long enough that she had begun to think he wasn't going to answer and was recalibrating her expectation. Then, because you're the only person I've ever met, he said, who would actually know me if I let them, who would not be managed by the surface version, who would see exactly what I was doing and call it by its name. He paused. And because I've always thought, in some part of myself, I didn't let run anything, that being truly known by someone like that would be worth every difficult thing it required. He met her eyes. I was right, it is. She held his gaze. The bond was loud. Everything was loud. She reached over, without planning to, and covered his hand with hers. He went absolutely still. She felt the shock of it through the bond, the spike of something that was not quite surprise and not quite relief, but contained both. The quality of someone who has been very patient about something for a very long time and is discovering that the patience was not wasted. She kept her hand there. They sat in the mountain light until the cold drove them inside. The attack came 3 days after they returned to Thornvale. Not the large incursion they had been preparing for, something more specific, more targeted, with the quality of a move designed to disrupt rather than to conquer. A strike at the Greywood, survivors' temporary shelter in the eastern Ashenwilda. Not an attempt to hold territory, an attempt to send a message. Reva was at the archive when the alarm came. She was moving before it had fully resolved out the door. shifting as she ran, wolf form by the time she reached the eastern quarter, and behind her the sound of other pack members mobilizing with the specific organized speed of a pack that had been drilling for this. She reached the Greywood shelter in 8 minutes. The Stormridge wolves were still there. Not many 4, maybe 5, sent as a precision team rather than a force. They had the quality of wolves following orders rather than making choices, focused on specific targets, moving with the mechanical efficiency of something that had been planned in advance. She took down the nearest one before it saw her, which was the advantage of being low to the ground and very fast and already in fighting form. The Stormridge wolf was bigger. Most of the Stormridge wolves were bigger, but size in a forest fight was a mixed advantage, and Reva had been fighting in this forest since she was 10 years old, and the forest itself was, in some sense, on her side. She was aware of Calder's arrival, seconds after hers, in the specific way she was aware of him now. Not just the compass warmth, but his physical presence, the combat register of him, the way he moved in a fight. He was to her right, engaging 2 at once with the particular style she had seen him use in training, controlled, efficient, with none of the chest-beating aggression of wolves fighting for performance, only the clean economy of someone whose goal was to end the fight, not to win it. They fought without communication and without collision, which required a level of mutual spatial awareness that, she registered even in the middle of it, was unusual. She knew where he was. She didn't need to check. She oriented to him the way she oriented to the Ashenwilde instinctively, from a knowledge that had gone below the conscious level. When it was over, quickly, the Stormridge team had not expected resistance this fast or this organized, had not expected someone to already be there. She shifted human, breathing hard, and looked around at the Greywood shelter, and at Fail, who was pressed against the back wall with 3 pack elders and was unhurt, and at the 5 Stormridge wolves who were down but alive, which was Thornvale's policy for captives that she had upheld despite the difficulty of it. Calder appeared beside her. There was blood on his forearm, not deep. He was looking at the Stormridge wolves with the weight hanger she recognized now as his fundamental response to exactly this kind of thing. "This is a message," she said, "not an incursion." "Yes," he looked at her, "you're not hurt." "No." She was checking herself by habit. She didn't need him to ask, but she noted that he'd asked, and that the asking had arrived as concern rather than as the authority of someone monitoring an asset. "You need that arm looked at." After the debrief, he turned to look at the shelter, at the damage, at Fail's white face. "She needs to hear she's safe before anything else." He went to Fail without waiting for her response. Reva watched him crouch beside the girl, speak quietly, with the deliberate calm of someone choosing their register for a specific purpose. She watched Fail's breathing slow. She watched the white-knuckled quality of the girl's hands begin to ease. She stood in the aftermath of a fight in the forest she loved and watched him be gentle with a frightened young wolf, and felt the bond and her own heart arrive at the same thing simultaneously, which was, this is who he is. Not the arrogant ease, not the charm performance, not the man who ran after easy things to avoid the difficult one. This. She had been figuring out who he was apart from the bond. She had been asking the right questions, and the answers had been arriving, one by one, specific and real and unmanaged, and they had been building something, not the romantic story, not the goddess's narrative, not the bond's insistent gravity, but something that was hers because she had looked at it clearly and decided it was true. She crossed the shelter and crouched beside him. The debrief was long. The discussion about the Alliance timeline became urgent. Lyra made 3 decisions in 2 hours that restructured the Coalition's response protocol. Calder presented the historical precedent for the type of strike they just experienced, the targeting of vulnerable wards as psychological leverage. And Revau watched him lay out the pattern with the precision and the controlled fury that she now recognized as his most honest mode. The one where the arrogance and the ease were entirely absent, and what remained was someone who cared deeply and was very good at his job. She stayed after the debrief. Most people left. He was gathering his materials from the table when she said his name. He looked up. She had thought about how to say it. She had been thinking about it since the shelter, with the background processing of a person whose analytical mind had been making a determination, while the surface mind attended to other things. She had expected to find the precise language, the exactly correct framing, the unambiguous statement that could not be misread or overread or used as more than it was. What she found instead was simpler. "I've been figuring out who you are," she said. "I asked you to give me time to figure it out, and you did, and I have been." She held his gaze. "And you are," she paused. "You are exactly as difficult as I am, exactly as proud. You are arrogant in specific ways that are the arrogance of someone who has earned most of what they're proud of and is still working on knowing the difference." She paused. "You are also the person who has been patient with me for weeks, who told me the truth about the running and the easy things, who makes furniture in the back of your house because it requires you to work with the materials nature rather than against it, and who went to a frightened girl before seeing to your own arm." He was very still. "I am not undeciding my decision," she said. "I am making a new one based on evidence." She paused. "I want to know you. I've been finding out that I do know you more than I thought, and I want more of it. I want," she stopped. She had been very articulate until this sentence, and the sentence was the important one. "I want the difficult thing," she said. "I want the thing that requires both of us to be exactly what we are at full volume. I want." He moved. He crossed the table space in 2 steps and stopped just in front of her, not touching, the border of the space between them intact, still held, but barely. Close enough that she could feel the warmth of him, which was the warmth of the bond and also just warmth, just him, the Cedaran dark earth nearness of him that she had been navigating around for 3 years and was now standing inside of. "Say it," he said, quietly, not demanding, just, "There is one more thing," and say it. She looked at him. The dark eyes, the face without its performance, the man who had been patient for 3 years and 3 weeks and had never once asked her to be less than she was. "I choose you," she said. "Not the bond, you. Because I've looked at you clearly without the architecture I built to keep you at a distance, and you are," she paused. "You are the difficult thing I want." He reached up and put his hand against her face the way she had put her hand over his in the mountain light. The same careful quality, the same attention of someone handling something they understand is real and fragile and exactly worth the care. "Reva," he said. "Don't say anything obvious," she said. "I will like you less." He laughed, the full version, not the small private one, the real laugh, surprised out of him. And it was, she registered with something that was warm and exasperated and entirely, specifically hers. Exactly what she had always suspected it would be like. He kissed her. Not carefully. No, that's wrong. Not only carefully. Carefully and also completely, with the quality of someone who had been waiting for a very long time and was not now in any hurry, but was also not going to hold back the entirety of what they felt out of some miscalculated restraint. It was the kiss of someone who had been building toward this specific thing and knew its shape already, and was deeply glad to discover that the reality was better than any knowledge could have predicted. She kissed him back with equal completeness. She was not gentle in it. She was not, in general, gentle in anything that mattered, but she was present in it, entirely, the full weight of her attention and her will directed at the specific fact of him, which was, she thought, probably the most she had ever given any single thing. When they separated, the debrief room was very quiet, and the evening was coming through the windows in long copper light. "The goddess," she said, into the small space between them, "is going to be insufferably pleased about this." "She generally is," he said. "I want it noted that I made this choice, not the bond. He looked at her with the dark-eyed, steady regard that was just how he looked at her, and there was something in it now that was open in a way it hadn't been before, something that the 3-week patient watch had been concealing, something she recognized because she had felt versions of it herself in the dark mountain night and the creek bank, and every time the bond had reported his state at 2 in the morning. "I know," he said. "That's the only version I wanted." She stepped back. She picked up her materials from the table. She was aware, even in the stepping back, that the distance she was creating was different from every previous distance. Not protective, not managed, not the northeast when he was south. Just the ordinary space between two people who know they will close it again. "Come to dinner," she said. "My house, I'll cook." "You cook?" "Don't sound surprised." "I'm not surprised." He gathered his own materials, the corner of his mouth at that angle. "I'm making a mental note for future reference." "Future reference," she repeated. Ambitious for someone who just had their first kiss. He looked at her across the table with the full quality of his attention. "Riva," he said, "I have been planning a future with you since approximately the 2nd year I was in Thornvale. The kiss is the beginning of the middle, not the beginning of the beginning." She looked at him. She thought, 2 sides of the same coin. She had heard the phrase in the goddess rites, Selun's description of the mated pair, the ancient language of what the bond was supposed to mean. 2 sides of the same coin. She had always thought of it as a romantic metaphor, something softer than the reality. Now, standing in the copper evening light of the debrief room with the man who made furniture and mapped unofficial springs and went to frightened girls before seeing to his own wounds, the man who ran from difficult things and then turned back toward them and was patient with the cost, the man who was exactly as proud and stubborn and difficult as she was, and thereby the only person who would never ask her to be less, she thought. Not a metaphor. An accurate description. Same coin, different faces, both required for the coin to be what it is. The coalition met 3 weeks later in Thornvale's common ground, the full alliance, for the first time. Thornvale, Ironcliff, Mervale, Greywood survivors, and 2 smaller packs from the Eastern Range who had decided, on the evidence of Stormridge's methods, that neutrality was not actually available as an option. Rivas stood at the planning table between Cora Thane of Ironcliff and Bren Castor of Merville, and laid out the tactical assessment with the clean precision of someone who had been living with this data for weeks and had organized it into its most functional form. The room listened with the focused attention of people who understood that the quality of the intelligence they were receiving was directly proportional to their likelihood of survival. She was aware of Calder at the far end of the table, coordinating the historical and logistical synthesis, and the awareness was the compass warmth of the bond, and also something more ordinary and more specific, the awareness of him, the person, the particular gravity of his presence in a room that she no longer needed the bond to tell her about. She was aware of him the way she was aware of the Ashenwilde, as something known that she had learned to know, that she trusted in the way you trust things you have examined carefully and found solid. Lyra ran the meeting with the authority of a future alpha who had earned the room. Dren watched from the side with the quiet satisfaction of a man watching the work he had spent 20 years building come to fruition in his children. The plan was good. It was the best plan available to a coalition of limited resources facing a larger, better supplied aggressor, which meant it carried real risk, meant it required things from everyone present, meant it would hurt before it resolved. But it was good. At the end, Cora Thane said, "Who leads the advance assessment team? The one that goes into the high passes before the main response." Rivaz and Calder looked at each other across the table. "We do," they said without consultation. Castor made a sound that was approximately a grunt of satisfaction. Cora Thane's weathered face arranged itself into something that might have been a smile. Lyra did not smile. She was running a coalition meeting, but her eyes did something brief and specific. After the meeting, in the space where the common ground returned to being just the common ground, and people moved toward their dinners and their families and the ordinary evening, Rivaz found her father beside her. Dren Ashvane was 62 years old and had the look of someone who had grown into their authority without losing anything essential in the growing. He had Rivaz's eyes, or she had the clear gray of someone who had decided a long time ago to see things as they were. He looked at her in the way he had looked at her all her life, not with the particular attention of a pack alpha assessing a subordinate, but with the older and simpler attention of a parent who knew their child. "You look different," he said. "I'm the same." "You are," he agreed, "and different." He looked across the clearing to where Calder was speaking with Oren about something in the easy shorthand of people who had been each other's closest counsel for years. "Does he know what he's taking on?" "He was the one who didn't run," Rivaz said. Dren was quiet for a moment. "And you?" "I was the one who thought running was a plan." She paused. "It wasn't." Dren made a small sound that was his version of profound agreement. He put his arm around her shoulders briefly, the specific weight of a parent's arm, brief and certain, and not requiring any response, and then dropped it and turned toward the hall. "He was always meant to be Beta," he said as he went, "but I never thought you'd be the thing that showed him how." She watched him go. She thought about this. She thought, the goddess does not make mistakes. She had said this to the dark, the night of the full moon, as an accusation. She thought it now differently, not as surrender, not as the capitulation of a woman who had decided the goddess knew best and had handed over her own agency accordingly, but as something truer, as the acknowledgement that what Selun had seen in the arrangement of the world until they collided was not the bond itself, The bond was just the opening of the door. What Selun had seen was two people who were the same thing in different shapes, who could not encounter each other fully without management, without distance, without the convenient architecture of avoidance, and walk away unchanged. The bond had forced the encounter. Everything after that had been theirs. The night before the advance team deployed to the Ashenvane high passes, Reva walked in the Ashenwilder alone. She needed this still, the solitary forest, the particular clarity of the Ashenwilder in the dark before dawn. It was not running from anything. It was running toward something she had always been. The woman who knew this forest better than she knew most people, who had built her understanding of herself in these trees, who loved this place the way you love the thing that made you. The forest was different now, in the way that familiar places are different when you have been changed, not the forest itself, but the way it sat with her. The Ashenwilde had always been hers alone. Now it was hers and also shared, which she had spent years dreading as a diminishment and was discovering was not that. Was, in fact, the opposite. She ran the North Ridge in the dark, and the dark was cold and clean and entirely familiar, and the wolf sense was doing its constant reading of the night. And under all of it the compass of the bond was pointing south-southeast, toward the settlement, toward the particular stone building with the workshop at the back where she had spent 3 evenings this week, learning the vocabulary of joinery the way wood grain ran, and what it required from the hand and the tool. The satisfaction of a joint that fit, because you had understood what the material needed. She ran the ridge and circled down, and came back through the settlement, and stopped at her own house, and stood in the dark for a moment. She thought about what had changed, and what hadn't. What hadn't? She was still Reva Ashvane, tracker and scout, second daughter, fiercely independent, difficult by both gift and choice, not interested in submission of any kind and never going to be. She was still the wolf who ran ahead. She was still the woman who would walk northeast if she needed to walk northeast, for reasons that were entirely her own. What had changed? The walking was a choice now, not a flight. She thought about the bond, which she could feel, as she always could feel it, in the specific compass warmth of his direction, the low, resonant certainty of him. She had stopped fighting the warmth. Fighting the warmth was fighting herself at this point, and she had enough to fight that actually needed fighting. She thought about what Sable had said. Don't let the refusal become the cage too. She had not let it. She had, eventually, with the particular quality of a person who arrives at things in her own time and will not be rushed, found the difference between a choice and a wall. She had chosen. Not the bond, not the goddess's arrangement, not the convenient gravity of an inevitability she couldn't outrun. Him. Specific, real, difficult, known. The door of her house opened. She had not knocked or called or announced herself, because it was her house, and because Calder Voss had been spending enough evenings in it that the threshold had ceased to be ceremonial. He came out onto the small step with 2 cups of the morning tea she kept by the fire, which told her he had heard her wolf form on the North Ridge Trail and had timed the water accordingly. He handed her a cup. She took it. She looked at him in the pre-dawn gray, the disordered hair, the specific wakefulness of someone who had been up reading pack records by firelight, because that was what he was doing when she arrived in the evening, and he often couldn't stop once he'd started, which was a quality she recognized because she had the same one. North Ridge, he said. Yes. Any movement. Game only. The Stormridge advance markers from last week are all cold. They're waiting for us to make the first move. He nodded. He looked at the forest. She looked at the forest, too. The ashen willow in pre-dawn was its own particular thing, neither night nor day, the trees present without being specific, the whole forest suspended in becoming. We deploy at dawn, she said. Yes. She thought about the passes and the Stormridge consolidation, and the alliance and the risk assessment, which was honest and difficult, which said that what they were about to do was necessary and dangerous and the best available option. She thought about all of it with the clean, focused attention she brought to everything that mattered. I need you to know something, she said, before we go. He looked at her. I've been thinking about what the bond is, she said. Not what it does, what it is. She held her cup between her hands and chose her words with the care she gave to things she was only going to say once. I think Selun doesn't bond people because they're already perfect for each other. I think she bonds people who have the right material and the wrong distance. She paused. The bond doesn't make us compatible. We're compatible because we're the same thing in different shapes, and we've spent 3 weeks proving it. The bond just made the distance impossible to maintain. He was very still, watching her with the full quality of his attention. I'm saying, she continued, that the choice I made was real, is real, not because the goddess forced my hand, but because I looked at you clearly without the distance and decided. She met his eyes. I want you to know that, not because I'm asking for anything from it, because it's the truth and you asked me to be honest. He set down his cup on the step. He turned to face her fully, and in his expression was the thing she had learned to read as his most honest face, open, direct, the arrogance and the ease and all the surface layers genuinely absent, just him, the full weight of who he was in this specific form. I know, he said. I've known since you said it in Lyra's debrief room. He paused. I need you to know something too. Tell me. I am going to be difficult, he said. Not about this, not about you, not about what we are, but in general. I am arrogant in specific ways, and I know which ways, but I'm not always going to catch it in time. I run the room like I own it sometimes before I've checked whether I've earned the room. I'm competitive about things that don't require competition, and I have strong opinions about situations that don't require my opinions. He held her gaze. I will be better about all of it. I am actively working on all of it, but I will also sometimes fail at it, and I want you to know that I know that, and that you can call it out and I will hear you. She looked at him. Are you asking my permission to be imperfect? I'm telling you what to expect. I know what to expect, she said. I've been watching you for 3 years. She paused. And I know what I am. I don't need you to edit yourself. I need you to be honest about the difference between when you're performing and when you're not. She paused again. You're not performing now. No, he said. Good, she picked up her cup. Don't start. He almost smiled, the small, private version. You either. She looked at him in the pre-dawn gray of the ashen willow morning. This man who was difficult and real and hers in the way that things are yours when you choose them clearly. And felt the bond and felt herself, and felt the forest around them, which was alive and old and rooted in ways that outlasted the decisions of any individual thing living in it. When we come back from the passes, she said, yes, I want to learn more of the joinery vocabulary. She held his gaze steadily. The chair you're working on, the one with the curved back, I want to know how the joint works. He looked at her. Something moved across his face, something warm and large, and she thought, not entirely unlike what she felt, the specific weight of a person recognizing that they have arrived somewhere worth arriving. Whenever you want, he said. Above them, the Ashenwilda was beginning its morning conversation. The birds starting, the soil exhaling, the water moving in the deep places below the oldest roots. The light beginning its slow work of making the specific out of the general. Rivat Ashvane, who ran ahead, stood on her own threshold and watched the sun come up over the forest she was made of. Beside her, at her shoulder, not behind, not ahead, even parallel Calder Voss watched it with her. The bond hummed between them, warm and certain. She left it exactly where it was. Priestess note, the goddess's patience. It is said in the oldest rites of Selun that the moon goddess does not speak directly to her wolves. She speaks in arrangements, in the placing of one person in the path of another, in the timing of full moons, in the choosing of which two lives will press together until the friction between them generates the kind of light that lasts. She does not apologize for the difficulty of this. She does not explain herself. She simply arranges the world and watches, with the patient satisfaction of someone who has been making this particular kind of arrangement for longer than any of her wolves have been alive. While they rage and refuse and build their architectures of avoidance and spend years going northeast, when south would be faster. She watches while they figure out who they are apart from the bond, and in the figuring out discover that who they are is, in fact, exactly the point. That the bond did not choose them despite their difficulty, but because of it. That the things that make Rivat Ashvane the most exhausting person in a room are the same things that make her the best person in a crisis, the most honest person in a negotiation, the wolf who runs ahead but always knows exactly where she is. That the things that make Calder Voss insufferable in a meeting are the same things that make him extraordinary in one. That the arrogance and the ease and the history of running from things are all weight-bearing structures in the man who stayed. The goddess watches, and she is, as Rivat predicted, insufferably pleased. Two sides of the same coin, the oldest magic, the simplest arrangement, the most difficult choice, made freely, made well. In the Ashenwilda, the morning comes. The roots go down for centuries. The wolves run. She didn't want to be claimed. She wanted to be known. It turned out the goddess had always understood that these were the same thing, dressed in different fears.